It is good to see, I think, how journalists and academic researchers often are working closely together in the current field of terrorism. It is a kind of history in the making, for which the basic facts that journalists often gather first come to without the background and analysis that scientists provide, and the other way around. Look, for instance, at the now world-famous ISIS files, a stash of 15,000 pages of internal Islamic State documents that the New York Times has found in an abandoned building in Iraq. It contains a tremendous amount of information on the inner workings of the terrorist group. There has been a lot of controversy, and I know that scientists do not always like the way in which journalists work. But in this case, it is crystal clear, I think, that the information would have been lost without a journalist on the ground who decided to take it with her, and now the documents are available to scientists. Similar efforts have been made by academic researchers, such as Aaron Zalem, the man behind jihadology, to make primary source material available. That is something journalists can benefit from, as not every colleague can manage, for instance, to follow all the terrorist channels on Telegram. Few Western journalists do read Arabic, and for them the translations and interpretations that a scholar such as Ayman Jawad al-Tamimi provides are a highly valuable source. Speaking about terrorist channels, one point in which the press should rely a lot more, I think, on the knowledge of researchers is the interpretation of who is who on this kind of channels. Quite often, a communication such as a threat against a particular country is reported as being a threat from the organization, like Islamic State, while in fact it only comes from an individual member. That is problematic. There's no journalist on earth, I hope, who would report that the United States have declared a war because a single citizen has called to attack this or that country. Even with terrorist groups, there's an important difference between official communications and things that are spread by what we often call fanboys. It doesn't help the understanding of how terrorists work to mix that up. For the very same reasons, I think that law enforcement too should cooperate more with specialists. When we are speaking about terrorism coming out of Syria and Iraq, it is often very difficult to understand the background, the differences between several groups who are involved, and the difference it can make at which point in history exactly someone belonged to one of such groups. It is fair to say, for instance, that an individual who belonged to Jabhat al-Nusra back in 2014 also belonged to Al-Qaeda, and thus was a part of an internationally oriented terrorist group. Sometimes things evolve surprisingly fast. In Belgium, we had the case of Bassam Ayachi, a self-styled sheikh with Syrian roots. While he was living in Brussels, he was known as the single most important figure of the Belgian jihadist scene, and his name appeared in almost every terrorist investigation that we have had for decades. After he left for the Syrian war, however, he became a much more moderate voice. He disencouraged Belgian Muslims, for instance, to leave for Syria, saying that they weren't needed there. While his militia still can be considered as an Islamist one, it doesn't aim at terrorism in the West. It is strongly opposed against Islamic State, and Ayachi himself has survived several Islamic State attempts to murder him. So, even when I wouldn't say that he can be fully trusted now and should be exonerated completely, I think there is a big difference between people who support him and people who support Islamic State. It is extremely important for everyone who's working in the field of terrorism to get the context straight. A good example of how things can go wrong when that context is lost has happened in the Netherlands. There, a newspaper made a scandal out of the fact that the Dutch government had given material support to a Syrian militia deemed to be a jihadist group. At least, the journalists concluded that it was a jihadist group because Dutch law enforcement was prosecuting a foreign fighter who had joined it as if he were a terrorist. According to all specialists, Dutch law enforcement was wrong, and the defendant was acquitted, by the way. But the scandal did persist, although it wasn't one. And the journalists who brought it out have received a string of awards by now, for what was basically fake news. I think this is a good example of the superficiousness and the jumping to conclusions that can arise when journalists, academics, and also investigators do not confront their findings enough with the knowledge of others. In Belgium, we even have a case in which a woman was convicted for belonging to a group in Syria, said to be a faction of Islamic State, while in reality that group was fighting against it. When the prosecutor was asked about that, he told the reporter that all of those groups are to a certain degree influenced by Islamic State. That's a bit the same as saying, for instance, that all centrist political parties here in the West are the same as far-right ones, just because they have adopted some of the same views. Luckily, I would almost say, the group to which this woman belonged, albeit no part of Islamic State, was also jihadist, and she herself had uttered threats against the West, so it wasn't entirely wrong to sentence her for membership of a terrorist group. But again, it is a case that underscores the importance of a detailed context, and thus cooperation between all kinds of specialists. Whether you're a journalist or an academic, in the current field of terrorism, you have to follow things 24/7 to be able to make the right judgments and to get the context straight. There have been many examples already of respectable media outlets who get that context terribly wrong by not confronting their findings enough with the knowledge of specialists. And unfortunately, there are even examples of highly esteemed scientific publications doing the same. In a recent article published by a leading academic journal in the field of terrorism that intended to review, as a first, the tactics and the planning behind the November 2015 Paris attacks, almost every paragraph contained factual errors, making it hard to take the rest of it serious. Scientists are masters of method in comparison to journalists. But in this case, every journalist who has worked extensively on these Paris attacks could have helped the authors to avoid those mistakes when they had simply been asked. Sometimes a journalist is more of an expert in this field, sometimes an academic is. And often there is even a third category. Indeed, we shouldn't forget the many amateurs researching terrorism with a very high level of seriousness and a tremendous knowledge on specific facts. A world-famous example of such an amateur who managed to become a reference is Elliot Higgins. He started to document the Syrian war without any scientific or journalistic background, but the Bellingcat he founded nowadays is a monument of open source investigation in many fields. In terrorism research, there are many others like him, often specialized in a very particular part of it. Take for instance Hugo Kaman, the world's one and only expert on the vehicles that terrorists are using to commit suicide attacks, which types they use, how they modify them, and how their know-how has evolved during the past few years. He's one of those enthusiasts who gather knowledge just by being fascinated, honestly interested, and not giving in to any pressure on what should be told or what should be kept quiet. I have cooperated with this kind of experts quite often already for my own reporting, and I have to say that they often have been the most valuable sources of information, both on context and facts. So, all of this to say that the current research into terrorism very much needs the cooperation between people with very diverse backgrounds. I am part myself of several discussion groups, be it on Twitter, be it on Telegram, be it on WhatsApp, where information, knowledge and views are exchanged. Most of those groups are a mix of journalists, academics and high-level amateurs. I think it is extremely interesting and extremely fruitful to promote that kind of cooperation. The current wave of terrorism, that with a jihadist background, will persist for quite some time, I'm afraid. And as we see it going on, an anti-Thetic, far-right, anti-Islamic violent movement is coming up already. For that, to get the facts and background straight, there won't be much difference in the need of cooperation between all kinds of specialists.